Of the innumerable faces that have come and gone on this planet, none has been painted, depicted, destroyed, cursed, mourned, mocked, praised, faked, or reproduced as frequently as that of the one and only Jesus of Nazareth. Over the past 2000 years, it has become a mirror to humanity, reflecting our faith and suspicion, hope and wrath, wisdom and barbarity, compassion and madness. Even the name is like a mirror image of itself. Jesus in Aramaic has the same meaning as Christ in Greek, anointed Savior. From the first symbols of faith etched by fingernails in Roman caverns to the murals of the Sistine Chapel, from El Greco's visions to the nightmares of Delhi, from Byzantine icons to the crosses of modern necklaces, Christ has become the most common subject of depiction in the history of mankind. On the other hand, this is probably the only image which has been so diverse in its depiction, yet so inevitably recognizable. This is partly because in some other religions the depiction of God or the pronunciation of His name is forbidden. This is also partly due to the fact that none of the other gods were so familiar and similar to mortals, such that artists would often bestow Christ with the facial features of their contemporaries, their compatriots, or even of their own. And finally, this is due to the fact that all of the paintings of Jesus of Nazareth were made after his death. Almost all but one. This is the story of the only portrait of Jesus alive, painted just 2 days before his crucifixion. In 33 Anno Domini, in the city of Urha, renamed Edessa a century earlier, on the 14th day of the month of Adar, the Aramaic name for March, there appeared a young man named Hanan, the secretary and messenger of Abgar, the king of Armenian Mesopotamia. Hanan was traveling to Jerusalem to deliver a letter to Jesus Christ from Abgar, which said, "My Lord, I have heard of thee and of thy healing, that it's not by medicines and roots thou healest, but by thy word thou opens the eyes of the blind, thou makes the lame to walk, cleanses the lepers, and makes the deaf to hear. Them thou healest by thy word, thou also raisest the dead. And when I heard of these great wonders which thou dost, I decided in my mind that thou art the Son of God, who dost all these things. Therefore I have written to request of thee to come to me, who adore thee, and to heal the disease which I have, as I believe in thee. I possess one small and beautiful city, and it is sufficient for 2 of us to dwell in it in quietness." This is how the correspondence between the Armenian king Abgar and Jesus began, as did the amazing story of Christ's portrait, as presented in Movses Khorenatsi Armenian History. Khorenatsi's narrative uses in turn 2 other, earlier sources, the 4th century church history by Eusebius of Caesarea and the doctrine of Thaddeus the Apostle, written by Aramaic historian Cherubim in the 1st century. Cherubim, who had written Hanan's testimony, said that on the 12th day of the month of Nisan, which is April, Hanan entered Jerusalem and saw Jesus near the house of senior Jewish priest Gamaliel. Horinotsi focuses on the historical commonalities, saying, "The letter bearers met him in Jerusalem." The word of the Bible confirms this as well, saying, "There were pagan men who had come to him." That was why the people were afraid to tell Jesus directly, and they told Philip and Andrew, who then told Jesus. In chapter 12 of the Gospel, according to St. John, it is said, "They came to Philip with a request. 'Sir,' they said, 'we would like to see Jesus.' Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified.'" What did "to be glorified" mean? After all, the miracles of healing, turning water into wine, feeding 5,000 with bread had all happened already. The Latin translation of these words of Christ also have significance. "Venit hora et clarificetur filius hominis." That is, the time has come for the Son of Man to clarify everything. Where the key word is not glory, but clarity. Had he decided to clarify something in the letter addressed to a foreign king 2 days before his crucifixion? Or maybe he meant another sign besides the letter? In the Aramaic manuscript, The Doctrine of Thaddeus the Apostle, this scene continues in the following way. When Jesus received the letter, he said to Hanan, "Go and say to thy Lord, who hath sent thee to me, Blessed art thou, who although thou hasn't seen me, believest in me, for it is written of me, those who see me will not believe in me, and those who see me not will believe in me. But as to that which thou hast written to me, that I should come to thee, that for which I was sent here is now finished, and I am going up to my Father who sent me, and when I have gone up to him, I will send to thee one of my disciples, who will cure the disease which thou hast. Thy city shall be blessed, and no enemy shall again become master of it forever." But the most astounding revelation is in the following paragraph. When Hanan, the keeper of the archives, saw that Jesus spoke thus to him, by virtue of being the king's painter, he took and painted a likeness of Jesus with choice paints, and brought with him to Abgar the king, his master. Was that legendary portrait an enigmatic message through which Jesus chose to be glorified, or rather to clarify for us something important? 2,000 years later, in an attempt to solve this mystery, I traveled to Edessa to see with my own eyes that small and beautiful city to which Abgar has invited Jesus. I knew that the portrait had left the city a long time ago, but in order to shoot the film and, most importantly, to find traces of the holy portrait, it was necessary to go to where the whole story began. These places, bearing the forgotten names Osroene and Come Again, have always been the northern gates of Mesopotamia and the gateway to the Euphrates Valley. It's not in vain that these cliffs around Edessa are furrowed with man-made caves where people would retreat in defense from numerous invasions, transforming them into impregnable fortresses. This is where rations and treasures were probably hidden from plunderers. In the 11th century before Christ, the ruler of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser, captured this land called Kumush after its king Mushech. The name Kumush was transformed by Greek historians to Komagene, while Musher's clan went north, where some of them founded the city of Mush, and another part reached the coast of the Black Sea, where they were called Meschi and Somchi, as Georgians call Armenians to this day. Sculptures of eagles and lions still remain in the territory of Osroene and Comagene. The dynastical name of King Abgar has been passed down in Aramaic and Roman sources as Aryuts, an Armenian word meaning lion. And Edessa, the ancient capital of Armenian Mesopotamia, is now called Urfa, which sounds quite similar to its old biblical name, Ur. In the 11th chapter of Genesis, it is noted as the birthplace of Abraham, the forefather of the Arabs and the Jews. And Terah took his son Abraham, his grandson Lot, and Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. Near the entrance to this cave where Abraham was born, a mosque has now been built. Only the Kurds now come to pay homage to the birthplace of the Arabs and Jews' forefather. And sometimes pilgrims come here from neighboring Syria and Iraq. A spring flows from the cave as it did 1,000 years ago. This legendary sanctity has been fitted with a modern tap through which it is portioned out into cups. A sheet of glass, fogged over by the breath of pilgrims, covers the entrance to the cave where the biblical prophet was born. These fish from Dayson River are also considered sacred. It is prohibited to catch or eat them, due to which they reach huge sizes and numbers. But I didn't come here for these wonders. The holy water flowing out of Abraham's cave holds the answers to at least two of the mysteries of this ancient city. The first is its name, Edessa, which has probably come from the name of this river, Daysan. Secondly, the spring flowing from the cave explains at least one of the reasons for the impregnability of this fortress. The present residents of this ancient city seem cut off from its majestic past by a trench of oblivion. Although the role of Edessa in world history and specifically in Armenian history is unique, it hasn't been properly appreciated to this day. Over the past 2,000 years, it was as if a magical force attracted Armenian kings and poets, knights and monks to this city. The Armenian community has been living in this Aramaic land since the 1st century before Christ, when Tigran the Great placed his forces in the strategic passages between the Euphrates and the Tigris. On the orders of King Abgar, the statues of the pagan gods as well as the royal thrones were moved to Edessa. It was here that those old gods were usurped when Abgar was the first king in those lands to accept Christ's teachings in 33 AD. It was Edessa where the only portrait of Christ alive was brought by the king's messenger Hanan. This is where the apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew had come from Jerusalem in order to preach Christianity. It was in the archives of Edessa, created by King Abgar, that Mesrop Mashtos discovered ancient Armenian manuscripts protected from decay and destruction in the end of the 4th century. And it was here that he created the new Armenian alphabet based on those manuscripts and saved the nation from assimilation. I thought about all this as I walked through the ruins of the royal palace, of which only these 2 pillars remain today. I tried to imagine the library where Mashtots had found the ancient manuscripts and the mansion of the king to which Abgar had invited Jesus. It is these pillars which form the symbol of Edessa, undoubtedly the point where the king would place the portrait of Christ knocking down the old pagan gods off the pillars. The historian Cherubim wrote the following: When King Abgar saw the portrait of Christ, he took it with delight and placed it with great glory in the palace, and he renounced the paganism with which they had lived until that day, and he turned towards Christ. And he went to the temples where sacrifices were made to Neb and Bel, and he demolished their statues. The writings in Aramaic on the eastern pillar testify that it was built in honor of Salmas, the daughter of King Menua. A brief bird song rang out at that moment. I turned my camera's objective towards it and suddenly noticed that the rock on which the bird was perched bore preserved traces of etched decorations. It seemed like a sign. I removed the camera and froze. At the base of the pillar, the outline of a face, partly erased, could be clearly seen with a halo of light on its head. Was this the miraculously preserved remaining of the bas-relief of Jesus, sculpted and later erased on a piece of rock? After all, once he had removed the old gods from these pillars, this is precisely where King Abgar would place the portrait of the new god. But he would not have left the priceless and fragile original to the mercy of the rain and the sun. He must have ordered that it be copied on to the most durable of materials, the stone. And naturally, the stone carving of Christ had to face Edessa, that small but beautiful city to which Abgar had invited Jesus. Standing at that spot, where the first king believed in the new God 2000 years ago, I thought about Abgar and the revolution that must have occurred within his soul. But in order to properly appreciate that exploit, one has to understand what he gave up for the sake of his new belief. I wanted to see with my own eyes the old gods which Abgar rejected for Christ. In order to do that, I had to up to the summit of Mount Nemrut, where the statues of the old gods of the east and the west rise up like an eighth wonder of the world, an idea realized by Alexander the Great and completed by his renowned followers, King Mithridates of Pontus and Tigran of Armenia. It was during the life of Abgar that a huge revolution took place, which even resulted in a change to the global calendar era. Abgar was unique in that he was the only ruler of that time who understood the immensity of the events which occurred, and he was the first king in the world to accept the teachings of the rejected and crucified prophet who taught people to love their enemies. And while Tigran and Mithridates were trying to unite the gods of the world, Abgar took a step farther. He accepted a single and universal God. At the epicenter of this spiritual revolution lay the holy relic of a new religion, the portrait of Jesus Christ. My search brought me back to Edessa, the city of old prophets and merchants. But I would find evidence of the erstwhile glory of Edessa and the legacy of our ancestors in its narrow and crooked streets. As if by instinct, I recognized the houses in the Armenian quarter as well as the old churches which had been turned into mosques. It was as if an unknown magnet attracted Armenians to this city, forcing them to defend it from the Persians, Arabs, and Turks. When the enemy would succeed in conquering the city, a series of stubborn attempts to liberate Edessa would begin immediately. Even when the whole of Mesopotamia fell to the rule of Seljuk Turks, the only free city remained Edessa, under the rule of the Armenian prince Toros. During the First Crusades, in the 11th century, the Europeans rushing to Jerusalem found their Christian allies, the Armenians, in Edessa. The Crusaders saw fortresses and churches here of a beauty that they had never seen before. These soon became examples for the whole of European medieval architecture. The Armenians probably thought at first that the Crusaders were some kind of heavenly army sent to save and reward them for their resilience and faithfulness. On 6 February 1098, Count Baldwin de Bourges entered Edessa with a small cavalry unit at the invitation of the Armenians. This is how the Crusaders historian Albert of Aachen described it. The Armenian Prince Theodorus embraced Count Baldwin. Then they removed their shirts and were tied together with one cloth, taking an oath of faithfulness. Thereafter, the Armenian prince gifted his city to the Frenchmen. It seemed that on that day the dream of Alexander, Tigran and Mithridates was coming true, the kings and gods of the East and West coming together in a fraternal embrace. It seemed that the spiritual legacy was fulfilled of Abgar, the first Christian king of the whole world. Before a year had gone by, Baldwin broke his oath, conspired against Prince Taurus and killed him. Armenian historian Matthäus of Urha described the behavior of the Franks in his native Edessa as follows. And thus they destroyed each Armenian prince, one after the other, even those who had been saved from vengeance at the hands of the Turks. They chained some in prisons and tortured them. They blinded others, cut their arms or crucified them. And they committed many such crimes in order to steal our treasure, ruining our state and tormenting our people. The cruelty and greed of the Crusaders meant that half a century later, when the Turks launched a new attack, they were left alone and couldn't defend Edessa. On the Catholic Christmas Eve of 1144, the impregnable fortress city fell, which was described by Armenian Catholicos Nerses Shnorali in his poem entitled Lamentation of Edessa. In Edessa, then renamed Urfa, the history of the Armenian community, which spanned 2 millennia, ended with the massacre of 1895, which preceded the Armenian genocide. I found in the center of town the ruins of an Armenian church, preserved to this day, where a century ago the last heirs of Abgar and Taurus were burned alive. The walls still bore the signs of that fire. They bashfully lie behind wooden advertising billboards on the street. A lot of effort had been put into scratching and erasing all that remained of the crosses and inscriptions. The last historical document that contained any mention of what befell the Armenians of Edessa was probably a letter dated 29 January 1896, sent to the Italian ambassador in Constantinople from the Portuguese consul in Aleppo. I have the honor of informing Your Excellency about the tragic events which occurred last December. On Wednesday, the morning of the 28th, some Muslims warned their Christian friends to stay off the streets and remain at home because a massacre was being planned. Truly, at noon, a huge crowd gathered in the Muslim quarter. After a cry which sounded from the fortress, large armed gangs and policemen attacked the Armenian quarter from all sides. They broke the doors with axes and killed residents in a merciless manner. People tried to flee and save themselves, but the slaughterers followed their victims everywhere and burned down the houses where the Armenians tried to barricade themselves. The massacre lasted until halfway through the following day, and ended only when there was not a soul left. The Armenian church, where around 2,500 people, mainly women, children and the elderly, had hidden themselves, was attacked with oil and then set alight. Everyone died by fire or by sword. 400 people suffocated in the cellar alone. They say that the slaughter was initiated by the sheikh of the dervishes, Mullah Sayyid Ahmed. He forced an Armenian to lie on the floor and slaughtered him, singing a hymn which the Muslims recite during sacrificial rituals. That Mullah Ahmed had long been gathering the Muslims on the city square and making calls to kill the Armenians, saying that they did not obey the Sultan and were enemies of the state. Your Excellency, the local officials estimate that 600 Christians and 120 Muslims were killed. In reality, only 5 Muslims were killed. 3 died when they tried to occupy the church, and 2 were killed when dividing the plundered loot. It was difficult to put all this on camera, but I wanted to understand what was it that attracted our ancestors here in this way, forcing them to live, build, defend and liberate this city again and again. I guess there can only be one answer. For centuries, this city was a great symbol of faith to the people who first accepted Christianity, because it held the holy image which King Abgar received as a gift from Christ. No other holy relic could be compared to a portrait of Christ alive. Not the nails taken from the cross, or Longinus' spear, the Turin shroud, not even the legendary Holy Grail. After all, those were all reasons or results of the death of Jesus, while the portrait of Christ was a testimony to his life. But what happened to the portrait of Jesus? Why did it disappear from the annals of history after the death of Abgar, only to resurface 5 centuries later in strange circumstances? The sons of Abgar rejected Christ's teaching after the death of their father and returned to paganism. Meanwhile, at the end of the 5th century, Armenian historian Movses Khorenatsi stated, "The living portrait of the Savior is in Edessa to this day." The preservation of the holy portrait is often ascribed to Abgar's second wife, the Armenian princess Herine, who had hidden the portrait from the pagans. Midway through the 6th century, Greek historian Evagrius wrote in his ecclesiastical history about a dream seen by Eulalius, the bishop of Edessa, in the days when the city was under siege by the Persians. In his dream, an angel told the bishop that the city was being guarded by a holy relic hidden in the walls of the fortress. He removed a stone from the wall and found the holy portrait brought for Abgar. This is when categorical differences arose between the accounts about the origins of the portrait, presented by Byzantine clergy on one side and Armenian and Aramaic sources on the other. In Constantinople, the Ahiropoetic version of its origin is proposed, which in Greek means "not made by hand." According to that version, the portrait was not a masterpiece by Hanan who painted Jesus alive, but it was a miracle which appeared when Jesus washed his face and used a piece of canvas to wipe it dry. This became the official belief. Sometime later, a second version of that miracle surfaced, suggesting that the portrait appeared on a kerchief belonging to a Greek virgin, Veronica, when she wiped the blood and sweat off Jesus' face on his way to Golgotha. Why did these contradictions and legends arise? In order to answer this question, one has to understand the centuries-old sympathy and antipathy, friendship and animosity that existed between these two ancient fraternal nations, the Armenians and the Greeks. Immediately after the fall of the Roman Empire, a new kingdom of Byzantium began to form on the border between Europe and Asia. This empire was built more on spiritual, cultural and scientific power rather than the military strength. Constantinople seemed to be an island of civilization, majesty and high culture in the poor and tasteless surroundings of the Middle Ages. The moving force of the Byzantine miracle was a unique union of two ancient nations and cultures, the Greeks and the Armenians. During their collaboration, the main difference in their beliefs, the disagreement dating back to 428 about the nature of Christ, would come up time and again. The Greek patriarch Nestorius declared Christ to be both God and man, and that the two natures of divinity and humanity were both present, but not unified, within him. This created a schism in the Christian world. His opponents were angry. How could one separate the human and the divine in Christ if even in a regular mortal the soul is united with the body? This Byzantine innovation met with even harder opposition in Armenia, where the divine nature of Christ was declared monophysitic, which in Greek means that it is undivided or single. The Armenians secured God's singular nature in the name of the state's main Christian church, Echmiadzin, that means in Armenian, the only begotten. The Byzantines, in turn, developed a new definition of their faith. They believed that Jesus incorporated two different natures simultaneously, which was called Diophysitism in Greek. The hidden message of this belief was that if the King of Heaven was half human, then the Emperor of earthly Byzantine could be half God. This was a continuation of the ancient Roman tradition where each emperor would declare himself a god, which was considered a necessity in order to govern a huge and multinational empire. Such pagan worship seemed suitable to the Christian Byzantines as well. Therefore, the Armenian faith seemed dangerous to them because it mocked the fake divine nature of the rulers of Constantinople. Diophysitism was declared orthodoxy in Byzantium. In order to assert this, on 8 October 451, a universal council of churches was assembled in the capital suburb of Chalcedon. Representatives of all the churches in the world were present, except for the Armenians, Georgians and Caucasian Albanians, which were then part of the Armenian Apostolic Church. They were absent because Armenia was at war with Persia at that time. Before the council, the Armenians had asked for assistance from the Byzantines in this war, but they had received a strict precondition in reply. The Greeks had demanded that the Armenians renounce their monophysitic perception of Christ and recognize the superiority of the Greek Church. Thus, the Armenians were in two battles on the threshold of the Council of Chalcedon. The Persians were demanding that Armenians return to Zoroastrian paganism. The Byzantines were ready to sacrifice Armenia even to their sworn enemy Persia. In these tragic circumstances, the Armenians decided to fight. On 26 May 451, the famous battle occurred on the fields of Avarair. This was supposedly the first religious war in human history, when the Armenians were defending their faith. But the Persians who won the battle did not win the war. That was a miracle, or at least that was how it was described by the historians of the time as well as future generations. One of the reasons for the Armenians' fanaticism was the holy image, the face of Christ, which decorated the flags of Commander Vartan's army. After this, the holy portrait was on the military flags of all the Armenian armies from the 5th to 20th centuries. When the right time comes, we will also talk about the role that the holy portrait played in a recent war for Karabakh. In the Armenian Museum of History, even today, one can see the flags flown by Armenian volunteers in the Russian army who fought against the Persians and Turks in early 19th century. An unknown Armenian artist had portrayed two sacred Armenian symbols there, Mount Ararat with the Ark and a portrait of Christ, which was undeniably linked to the portrait brought for King Abgar by Hanan. Our battle was indeed a fateful moment in the relationship between the Armenians and the Greeks. The fact that Byzantium did not help its sister church and allied state left a bitter scar on Armenians' hearts. At the same time, after the Council of Chalcedon, the Byzantines began to fanatically edit the scriptures, removing all references to Armenians. Moreover, the whole military and administrative machine of the empire was dedicated to weakening and destroying the Armenian state and population. The villages and cities of Armenia were being ravaged. Armenians were being forced out to the eastern edge of the empire, away from their ancestral lands. This is why, for the Byzantines, the portrait of Christ could not be the work of Abgar's messenger Hanan, but rather had to be considered a miracle not made by hands. Any relation of the relic with the faithless Armenians had to be rejected. And nevertheless, it was the portrait of Christ that eventually reconciled Armenia and Byzantium, when from the 9th, 11th centuries, the latter grew into a Greco-Armenian world power, reaching the peak of its military might and spiritual strength. This is not an exaggeration. During those 2 centuries, the emperors and generals of Constantinople were Armenians, from Basil I and John Tzimiskis to Basil Bulgarochthonus and Constantine Porphyrogenetes. Byzantium was a multinational state, an attempt to establish the kingdom of heaven on earth, where in Christ's words there were no Greeks or no Jews, there were only the children of God, united and equal in their faith and faithfulness. The Armenian rulers of Byzantium were especially enthusiastic in trying to realize that beautiful illusion, since they felt the vulnerability of ethnic minorities more acutely. The Armenian emperors were the ones who were trying to liberate Edessa and return the portrait of Christ. After constant battles for a century, that dream finally came true in 944, when the Byzantine army, led by the Armenian princes Melech the Great and John Gurgenes, defeated the Arabs in Mesopotamia, and as the main prize for the victory, claimed the portrait, which was the greatest Christian relic. The holy image was immediately sent to the capital, to the Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenetes, who placed it in the most important temple of Byzantium, the Temple of Saint Sophia. I left for Constantinople, the city of 2 continents, 2 religions and 2 cultures. The holy image was brought by boat through more or less the same road, across the waters of the Bosphorus, where Emperor carried it through these gates into the temple. Through this door, which only the Emperor could pass, he took the portrait towards the altar. The transfer of the portrait from Edessa to Constantinople in 944 was considered an event of such importance that a new feast was added to the Byzantine calendar, the Feast of the Holy Image. The liberation of Christ's portrait caused a sensation in the whole of the Christian world. Endless rows of pilgrims came to the temple of Saint Sophia, the villagers and aristocracy, the monks and soldiers. In 957, 30 years before the Christianization of Russia, the Russian princess Olga had arrived in Constantinople for the specific purpose of being baptized before the holy portrait. Many had inscribed their names on the marble pillars of the temple. The pilgrims out of awe, and the Vandals out of hatred and jealousy. Some of these inscriptions remain in Saint Sophia today, making the temple seem even more like an occupied fortress. Beginning from the 6th century, the holy portrait gained recognition and glory in the whole of the Christian world as the true portrait of Christ and an example for all icons to copy. During centuries of iconoclasm, it was the holy portrait of Edessa that served as a factor in favor of their preservation. In 787, during the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, a special canon confirmed the sacred value of this portrait based on the affirmation of Christ's divine incarnation, which was thus not only seen in God's Word, but also through a tangible portrait of Jesus. In 1204, the Rock Fourth Crusade, which ended in the plunder of Constantinople instead of the liberation of Jerusalem, did not spare the Saint Sophia either. But even those robbers stopped in fearful reverence before the portrait of Christ hung on the altar. For a whole millennium, Byzantium resisted all its enemies through its strong faith and culture. But the kingdom later found itself mired in a swamp of mistrust, political crisis and corruption, forgetting its own mission. Even the prophecy of Christ was forgotten. Believe, and your city will be blessed, and no enemy shall ever conquer it. In 1362, Emperor John V Palaeolog transferred the holy portrait to Leonardo Montaldo, commander of the Genoese forces, receiving in return a promise of military aid and protection for the city against the Turks. This was probably a fateful mistake. Let us recall that Edessa fell to the Turkish yoke in 1144, exactly 200 years after the city parted with the holy portrait. In 1453, Constantinople fell too, only 90 years after the portrait of Christ was handed to foreigners. Thus, the last stop of our journey and our search was the ancient Italian port of Genoa, the native city of Columbus and Genes. 2000 years after Hanan left Edessa, taking King Abgar's letter to Christ in Jerusalem, nobody or nothing hinted about the treasure being kept in a small and inconspicuous Armenian church in this prosperous European city. But back then, in the 14th century, the Armenian community of Genoa paid a handsome sum to Count Montaldo in exchange for the holy portrait, on the condition that it would be kept in the city's Armenian church. The church of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle had been built in 1308 by Armenians who had migrated to Genoa from Edessa and Cilicia. Thus, 440 years after the holy portrait of Christ was moved from Edessa, the Armenians had it once again in their protection, highlighting their faithfulness to the tradition set by King Abgar. Armenian monks established the congregation of the holy portrait in the church, with a special mission of protecting the relic. Beginning from the 17th century, scientists studying the portrait discovered a simple wooden frame under the 10th century gold form. The wooden frame seemed to have been decorated with a chain of pearls back in King Abgar's time. There is an interesting detail. The gold frame bears an inscription with the Greek words "Do Agion Mandilion," or "This is the holy image." But these three words contain two grammatical errors, because the correct Greek version should have read "ton agion mandilio." This seems to be further proof that even the master goldsmith of the court was an Armenian, more adept at his craft than in the foreign Greek language. X-ray and tomography studies in the 20th century established that the paints were made using an egg base, which is an ingredient used traditionally since ancient Egyptian times. The age of the canvas and the pine frame dated back to the beginning of the Anno Domini calendar era. Here, in Genoa, we stood at the threshold of the modest Armenian church, a few steps away from the end of our journey through 20 centuries, thousands of miles, and lives of many people dedicated to the holy image. Now we will see the portrait of Christ, painted 2 days before his crucifixion. Are you ready to see God? Behold,